What is up, Paul? Dude, I'm so excited you're here on the Low Carb Hustle podcast with me. Thanks for joining us.
Hey Nate, it's great to be here. I'm excited to dive into this. It sounds like it's a topic that you've been pretty excited about and researched a lot into. So hopefully, I can provide some kind of context and guidance for you and your audience.
Yeah, I'm really excited because I feel like there's so much research emerging about the science of psychedelics, how it can actually benefit us. Some of the main goals that we're always looking at is like, how do we get leaner and live longer? And I think that a lot of times it comes down to that mental side, the emotional side, the spiritual side, more so than the physical side. So I want to dive into that with you. But for those people who are listening in who don't know who you are, can you just give us a little bit of like brief background on who you are and how you got to the point where you're like guesting on a podcast talking about psychedelics?
Yeah. So when I was 16, I started smoking cannabis. So for me, a lot of my stories start with taking illegal drugs, which take it as you want. But I grew up in a pretty traditional religious home environment. My parents are very anti-drug. They were not hippies, very religious people, also Democrats, so open-minded in many ways, supportive, and they found out that I've been smoking weed, and my dad sat me down, my mom as well, but my dad spoke to me and was like, I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident like 30 years prior to that.
Whoa.
They were like gobsmacked that I would ever do something like cannabis, and that was also because my mom has a sister who has struggled with drug addiction, and my mom perceived that her sister's drug addiction led to a lifestyle that was not healthy and not supportive and parasitic, and there just wasn't a really good relationship there. And I could see the rationale and logic in that. It was actually I don't disagree with my mom in that. But cannabis and especially psychedelics are very different in their applications, and especially when there's a intentional and responsible container for their use. They can be, clinical research has shown how healing they can be and also have these profound transformative outcomes. So a few years after that, I started working with LSD and psilocybin mushrooms in higher doses, not microdoses, typically in nature, in the woods, at the beach, at the lake. I went to university in a place called Holland, Michigan, at a small liberal arts school. So we would always go to the lake and hike with acid. And I would lead small groups of friends, or I would go with one or two friends, right? I was never doing it in like IMAS gone therapeutic container, like some of the clinical research. And my life was very changed by that and transformed by that. And I would say the core insight or download was like, the environment is very special. It's a place of healing and regeneration, and our health, both individually and collectively, is directly related to the health of our natural ecosystems. And so I felt this compulsion to professionally pursue a vocation which would help people to wake up to that and understand that on a deeper, more profound level. And so that inspired all my work with Third Wave. I just see the sort of biggest existential, or one of the biggest existential risks to us as a human species is, ecocide, the sort of destruction of our natural environment. And so if there was a tool that could quickly awake people to that fact, what if that tool was more widely accessible and skillfully used? That's what's always driven me. And so that story comes full circle when, soon after Michael Pollan's book came out, How to Change Your Mind, at this point, I had started Third Wave in 2015. I had run it as a small company for about a year or so. And since 2017, initially, it was just a hobby that I did for fun. And I ended up guiding my dad through a high dose psilocybin experience. He had experimented with microdosing. He had read Michael Pollan's book. Like I said, my parents are very open minded, and so he had this experience. It wasn't like, oh my God, profound, life changing, but it was beneficial. He had some insights. It was like a really useful experience for him. He enjoyed it overall. Like, he's glad he did it. And so that to me spoke to the power of like, I'm from the Midwest. My dad's never smoked weed. He's never drank. It's like people don't do psychedelics in Grand Rapids, really. It's not that prominent. So that to me really spoke to like this optimistic hope that I had that more and more people would be interested in it. And I've always really been interested in systems change, right? Looking at how do we perceive education and healthcare and lifestyle and business, and then, influencing the creators and builders and leaders of tomorrow to help build systems that are more in alignment with regeneration and harmony with our environment, and a relationship to this sort of non-human intelligence. These sort of slightly hippie, but also research backed now kind of perspectives that I think a lot of people would benefit from.
Okay, cool. So you started the third wave in 2015 with the goal of basically just kind of expanding human consciousness and opening people's minds to some of the things that are not necessarily prevalent in our kind of post-industrial society of desk locked work from home office people.
Right. Yeah. So as an educational platform specific to psychedelics, right, with a particular focus on microdosing, because my perception of microdosing was that it was a bridge to widespread cultural accessibility.
Okay.
So the best way to help people benefit and our culture to benefit from psychedelics is get more people to do psychedelics, which some people may disagree with me about, but I'm pretty keen on. I think just like more people would benefit from taking fish oil or taking creatine or doing a low carb diet or meditating for 25 minutes every day. There are certain practices that, if done consistently, will lead to broadly beneficial outcomes on both. First and foremost, what I've always looked at is physical health. I think the physical form is where everything starts, but then emotional and spiritual and relational health as well.
So if we're talking specifically about like psilocybin, what kind of physical benefits do you see when people start doing some like a microdosing protocol? Because it's kind of, when you're doing that sort of protocol, you're not necessarily tripping at all. You're not really feeling it. It's kind of below your conscious level, right? So what can people expect to, especially if they've never really even considered doing something like this? How do you describe this and sell it in a way that gets people who have never really thought that before to entertain the idea?
Yeah, so clinical data shows that microdosing helps with more energy, a better mood, and better sleep. More energy, a better mood, and better sleep. So those are the catalysts, right? Those are the things. Yeah, fantastic, right? And that's been proven in both experimental research. That's been proven in clinical research. There's this. We were just talking about this before we went live. In New Zealand, there's a clinical trial that's happening where they send people home with 10 micrograms of LSD, and they can take it in their everyday life. And there was just a paper published in Nature that showed LSD increases sleep duration the day after microdosing, right? And the same thing for energy and mood they found with outcomes. When people were doing this, the take-home microdosing LSD in New Zealand, there was a 60% reduction in overall scores of depression, and 53% of people no longer had depression.
That's insane.
Which is fantastic. It's about probably 50 to 60% better than average outcomes at this point in time. So huge uptick. And I think a lot of that comes down to what I would refer to as dendritic growth, the reconnection of neurons and brain pathways that have sort of died away or become obsolete. Microdosing reactivates that through the production of something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor. And that leads to a more plastic brain. It leads to a brain that can learn and adapt faster and quicker. And a lot of that has to do with inflammation. It actually helps to reduce inflammation in the brain. So it's been shown to have beneficial outcomes for TBI in particular. There's an ex-NHL Stanley Cup winner, Daniel Garcia, who played for the Blackhawks, was a huge bruiser when he played in the NHL. And he started microdosing after that, and it's significantly helped to heal a lot of the brain trauma that he's experienced. And he's shown this with even fMRI scans, right?
Wow.
So immensely helpful for TBI by reducing inflammation, allowing the sort of inner healing intelligence to come back online. And there's a direct gut-brain axis relationship. So it also reduces inflammation in the gut with microdosing. And so we know that a lot of lifestyle diseases are related to high inflammatory markers. When we can reduce chronic inflammation through with psilocybin in particular, this is a fully natural, herbal, non-addictive supplement regimen, which is fantastic. And that has, I would say, that beneficial outcome of kind of just reducing all the noise in our lives, right? And it allows for an openness, a space to open where we can start to be more creative and intentional with what we want to do. A lot of people are stuck in a reactive mode. Inflammation keeps us stuck in a reactive mode. And so when we become more less inflamed, when we have less noise, then we can create easier. And psychedelics help with that too at higher doses, right beyond microdosing. Psychedelics help us get clear on the vision of what we want to create and what inspires us and what we're driven by, all these sorts of things.
That's fascinating, especially when it comes to the inflammation in the brain, because we're seeing a lot of research showing like dementia and Alzheimer's are related to inflammation in your brain. So anything that we can do to decrease that is going to extend our mental health span, which I think is critically important. I also,
and there's been some early research on that. The biggest challenge right now, though, in the psychedelic ecosystem is because these are mostly still Schedule I substances. Research is extremely expensive to do still, which is very unfortunate. But I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll start to find some beneficial psychedelic plant medicines for Alzheimer's and dementia. There's some good early research, preclinical.
Wow. I also really liked how you described inflammation as noise. I would have never thought to describe it like that, but it's completely on the nose. It's perfect, because like when you have inflammation in your body and your shoulders, it's just this constant low grade like noise that you're experiencing, kind of like a physical pain level. And when you can reduce that in the body through, like use of aspirin, fish oil, recovery techniques, cold plunges, red light saunas, like you reduce the noise, you increase your ability to do more. And so I can only imagine that having that from a gut and a brain side perspective is going to allow you to reduce the noise and do more mentally, we were talking before on the call. I just finished do you say Stamets? Yeah. The Paul Stamets, like a psilocybin microdosing protocol over the course of like 4 weeks. And I would say if I had to go back and describe it one way, I would say that the noise in my brain was reduced. It's fascinating.
That's fantastic. And what I would add to that is this is where low dosing can be combined with other modalities. So yoga would be an example. Cold plunging, as you mentioned, is another example. But one of my favorites is body work, like rolfing, structural integration, fascia work, kind of deep tissue. I've done work with ketamine in particular. At higher doses, ketamine has an anesthetic effect. So there are really well-trained body workers that can get into these physical places even, and what it does on the mind is incredible, because in the more noise we have here, also it tends to be the more noise we hold in our body, one opens up the other.
Yeah. So something that you could like take out like a microdose, like psilocybin, ketamine, something like that, before you have body work done to see an increased effectiveness of that body work.
Overall, yes. Yeah. Ben Greenfield has also talked about this extensively on his podcast. He actually has some protocols that he's gone through. But the ketamine, in my case, was delivered either rectally or through a lozenge through the cheek. The IV and IM ketamine, not as useful or effective. So you really want the lozenges or troche, something that's an oral. And then it's helpful to have someone who's trained in how to work with it, but there's not many. There's maybe a handful.
That'd be a real small niche.
Yeah, but it's a great niche. I've experienced one guy in NorCal, and he's been doing this for 50 years. He heard about rectal ketamine in the gay community in the 80s and immediately wove it into his practice. And he's done work with over 3,000 people, he's kind of like a Zen master of sorts.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So like, I mean, I know we'll talk about this and I want to talk about like the third wave, but how do people start getting involved with microdosing for the first time, especially if you're like, you've been on the fence, you've heard about it, you've heard it on podcasts, whatever, Joe Rogan talks about DMT and stuff. So where do people go? How do they get started in something like this without going to like someone's sketchy cousin, behind the 7-Eleven?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This is like, where's the access? What I typically point folks to first is we have a private community platform. So we essentially have an app, Third Waves Community, you can download, you can start to connect with people. So I think one is just starting to build community in this space, talking with others, and our online platform makes that very easy to do. Go to an event or go to a conference. But if you're at home and you're just like, this would be a fun hobby, this podcast will be useful. Typically the reason people are interested in microdosing is because they're sick of being on antidepressants and they want something new that's less addictive, or they are interested in performance and cognition, overall energy. And so there's a lot of benefits you can take just from sourcing substances. Some people like to grow their own mushrooms. We have a grow kit that we have on our website and provide to folks. We have a 6-week microdosing experience. We also have a sourcing guide. And so in that sourcing guide, we recommend vetted providers. And so in the legal side of it is interesting because it's illegal in most places, but legal in enough places that no one's really looking at psilocybin and psychedelics in particular because there's such a big focus on fentanyl. So there's a lot of just websites that are openly selling it.
Okay.
One of them is called one is called wearmm1.com, which is a little hard to communicate on now that I'm reading it through. But MM1 is a brand that I trust and know. And so when I point people for psilocybin microdosing where they should go, that's a stack that it's like what you were talking about. It has psilocybin lion's mane, but then it has cordyceps, bacopa, long jack, and shilajit. And it's a really good stack for purely herbal, stack for focus and performance. So MM1, just go there. That would be also my right. Because the big thing is sourcing, creating a network and community. At the end of the day, you just want a supplement that you can take. That's easy.
Yeah, totally. But I think also like just knowing that you can go to the thirdwave.co and get connected with a community and actually be able to ask questions and go a little deeper, do some research on your own, I think is also helpful for a lot of people who are, maybe a little iffy on if this is right for them or not.
Yeah, so tons of educational resources. My book would be helpful as well, Mastering Microdosing. We have a podcast ourselves. We've done lots of educational podcasts on microdosing. You could listen to a few of those. I interviewed Paul Stamets, in fact, about a year ago. So that's a great
cool
podcast to start with. So there's a lot there that folks can dive into for free before they, take the plunge and start microdosing.
Got it. All right. And so with a lot of these microdosing protocols, it's like a couple weeks on, a couple weeks taking a break. Is there a downside? Will your body get used to or like kind of adapt to if you're taking it too frequently?
Well, I think it's like any other supplement in that way that it's always helpful to cycle a lot of supplements. 5 days on, 2 days off is typically what I hear for most supplements. So that 5 days on, 2 days off, I think with microdosing and psychedelics in particular, it's good to have a little bit more spaciousness. So the protocol you did is 4 days on, 3 days off, which is useful. And people do that for as long as 3 months. But typically what I tell folks is do it for a minimum of a month is a good first protocol because 30 days is enough time to start to see some of the outcomes and effects. Anytime before that, and it's a bit hard to discern. So I say always give it 30 days, just like with meditation, give it 30 days. And then after that, if you want to keep microdosing, if it feels good, keep microdosing. If it's helpful, if it's getting you out of a rut, if you're seeing good forward progress momentum, if you have good energy, you're sleeping well, keep microdosing. I've gone as long as 7 months microdosing twice a week with LSD. That was when I first did it. So that was like early guinea pig. Probably would weave in. I weave in a lot more breaks now. So I might microdose 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks in a row, but then I'll take 2 or 3 weeks off. At this point, I've been doing it about 10 years. So it's just more intuitive in terms of how I'm feeling and what I want to do.
Got it. All right. And will you switch up like, maybe microdose LSD for a little bit, then psilocybin based off of how you're feeling and what you feel you need?
Yeah, almost exclusively those two. I have LSD gummies, and then I like to do stacks, different stacks of psilocybin. So the one I usually use now is more for focus and performance and cognition, but I sometimes use ones that are more for meditation or relaxation. But most of the stuff I take is like 90% of it is more for like the focus, energy, motivation aspects.
Got it. So you'll take it like before a busy work day, getting on a podcast, things like that.
Correct.
Okay. How soon before will you take it? Are you feeling like direct effects like 90 minutes later, or is it like take it in the morning of a big day?
There's there's a little bit of a glide up. Like there's definitely a little bit of a come up for me because, for me, microdosing is more sub-intoxicating than sub-perceptual. I've written in my book, the subtitle is something about sub-perceptual use. But when I spoke with Paul Stamets, this is right after the book came out, unfortunately, when I spoke with Paul Stamets a year and a half ago, he described it as being sub-intoxicating, meaning you might feel a little bit. So sometimes you want to create space to have a little bit of a come up, nothing intense, but a little bit. some space to come down and breathe. So I'll usually do it first thing in the morning before I meditate. You know, I usually have an hour to 2 hours in the morning when I wake up to read and walk and chill and not do calls or talk with anyone. So I'll take it at that point in time, almost always.
Gotcha. Cool.
Typically
Really
in an
helpful.
empty stomach, but it depends if I'm taking other supplements that day as well. Like one drink, I drink this drink called Magic Mind, which I highly recommend. It's the best thing I've found in terms of a daily shot for memory and performance. And it's lion's mane. It's matcha mostly, but lion's mane and then bacopa and a few others. So if I take that, I need to have something in my stomach. So I'm mindful of like, if I'm taking a bunch of supplements, including the microdose, because I take creatine, I do probiotics, fish oil, you know, a bunch of stuff, lion's mane, cordyceps. I prefer to have some food in my stomach if I'm doing it.
Gotcha. Okay. So it sounds like you got a whole protocol around not just the microdosing side, but just for your physical health. What's like the one thing, I mean, maybe not even one thing, but like, where have you really noticed the biggest like change in energy, vitality, focus, that sort of thing? And like, yeah, where did that come from? You mentioned Magic Mind. You mentioned some of these other like microdosing protocols.
It's a great question. So there's probably a tactical response to that, and the tactical response is contextual, meaning it changes. So what my tactical approach the last 6 months is probably different than the preceding, let's say 12 months, which was different. There's always variability in the tactical approach of health and wellness, right? But I would say the core of it has definitely been the balance of relaxation with attention and focus and building. That I spent a lot of time in my 20s going all out. You know, I've traveled to 80 countries. I've lived in 12 cities. I've been nomadic for the last 12 years. I've started 3 7-figure companies. I've written 2 books. It's been an interesting journey. You know, I've been very active. So for me, especially as I'm 33, I'm still young. I mean, I'm still very young. But as I get into my 30s, I'm like, okay, how do I find more balance and relaxation? So saunas are key in that. Meditation for me has been fundamental for years, probably 15 years now as a practice. I sat in my first Vipassana last year, 10-day silent meditation retreat, and that was one of the best things I've done in Joshua Tree, beautiful location. And then plant medicine work, you know, every 6 months. I've been working more with ayahuasca the last year or so. So if I'm doing deeper ceremonial work, it'll typically be with ayahuasca. I've also not to steer the conversation too psychedelic, I'll bring it back, but I've also been experimenting with low dose 5-MeO pens. 5-MeO DMT is a synthetic. It also comes from the toad. It's called bufo. And at very high doses, it sort of blasts you into white light, unity consciousness, but you can actually low dose it and sort of do a stair step method. So I brought myself this weekend into basically a fully orgasmic state of bliss for about 10 minutes, just kind of stair stepping those pens, like full orgasm, body, nothing erotic, just physically. I was just like, what is, you know, it was incredible. Wow. So these peak experiences, you know, filled in with sauna, meditation. When I have access to it, a cold plunge, but I travel a bunch, so I don't always have access to a cold plunge. And I hate cold showers. I don't do that shit. Cold showers, just not, I'm like, but if the cold plunge is around, I'll do it consistently. And then I eat well. I've been eating paleo for 15 years since I was 19. You know, I've always been into performance. I cut out unhealthy deodorants and all that stuff 15 years ago. You know, I've been on this sort of hippie path for a long time, but I also care about physical performance. I was a college athlete, and so I've always been keen on. You know, I started doing CrossFit when I was 19 as well during the off season. So CrossFit turned me on to paleo. Paleo turned me on to LSD, and then LSD turned me on to digital nomading. So I was a digital nomad for a long time, which then turned me on to business and entrepreneurship. So
it's safe to say that CrossFit is a gateway drug.
Exactly.
Take that, Mom.
I mean, you've done CrossFit, right? Yeah. It was good for a season when in my mid 20s, when I could just 24, 25, 26, my form didn't have to be perfect. But now as I've gotten in my 30s, I'm like, I could easily pull my back.
Yeah. I don't need to be doing that many snatches. I just don't. Yeah.
Exactly.
What did you play in college?
I played soccer.
Cool.
Division III liberal in the small school that I went to. We were good. We ended up at like number 7 in the country my senior year. So we had a solid crew, and we had this rivalry with Kelvin College, which was another. the school that I went to is, it's called Hope College. It's very RCA, Reformed Church of America. You know, all of the faculty have to be professing Christians. It was founded by very Christian people. My dad's worked there for 43 years. I got free tuition, which was fantastic. And we had this crosstown rivalry with another school called Calvin College. So it was the Calvinists, you know, John Calvin against really the kind of Lutherans. Back to you know, history again. And so we had this really deep rivalry. It was fun.
That's cool, man. I like the idea of, like,
piece,
you know, getting into LSD based.
I wish I'd started to do acid in college. I wish I had known about microdosing, because I totally would have been the guy that would have microdosed acid before games. Like that would have been something I wish I had known about when I was a college athlete. I was doing high doses in the off season, or sometimes in season, but just after games, not during games. And that would have been really interesting to explore.
So let's talk a little bit about macro dosing, or just like taking higher doses of psilocybin or LSD. And I think that, like, a lot of, you know, biohackers and people who, like, you know, kind of will talk down about, like, talk therapy, kind of present them as this panacea, this amazing thing that, like, just take DMT, do an ayahuasca ceremony, and that's going to fix your problems. But I feel like, can you clarify this a little bit, or just talk about your experience about how it's not necessarily the end all be all, but it's just kind of a vehicle for helping you do the work?
Yeah. So there's two ways to think about it. One way is that a great healing container has certain elements, irrespective of whether psychedelics are in that healing container or not, or every coaching container, or every bodywork container, or whatever is, you know, the type of container that you're creating. But that relationship between two people, or that relationship between a group, it can be both individual and group, has to be of trust, has to be of safety, has to be of, you know, good practices, these sort of things. Now, psychedelics, when introduced into that container, I think make the overall outcome, they accelerate the overall outcome. They help the individual and the group to explore new dimensions of self and learn certain things that would otherwise not be possible to learn in everyday waking consciousness. And there are also containers that are very specific to psychedelics, that, when done well, can be even more profoundly transformative than if psychedelics are just sort of used as a more commodified tool. You know, I think psychedelics in and of themselves, because of their lineage, our history of use, the ritual that's gone with them for many thousands of years, which is where this whole notion of the third wave of psychedelics comes from. The first wave being indigenous and ancient use. This is an applied practice that is ancient. In its origin. It's much different than Freudian talk therapy. It's much different than, you know, Hakomi. It's much different than Gestalt. It's much different than whatever. Fill in your blank. Performance coaching, all of the stuff that we usually talk about. 95% of modalities, I would say, are not. They don't have that lineage. And I really love so Taleb, who you may be familiar, Black Swan and Anti-Fragile, and, you know, this guy who is quite obnoxious on Twitter, but otherwise a very brilliant individual. He talks about something called, he's the worst. I'm just like, he talks about something called the Lindy effect, which is the longer an idea or technology has been around, the more utility it has for us as a human species. Like the Bible, the fact that book has been read for 1800 years means that in another 2,000 years, people will still be reading it likely. Longevity is a huge indicator of success. Psychedelics have that track record. So we also need spaces that are held by indigenous ancestors, that people connected to lineage. I create my own spaces. I guide ceremonies and create ceremonies. I have for many years now, but as part of our practitioner training, I lead a high dose psilocybin ceremony for about 45 people. And so I have certain aspects. I bring in musicians, you know, we have silence, there's a little breath work. So I've constructed it in my own unique way, but it is very specific to working with mushrooms. If you could just do a meditation like that as well, but it wouldn't have the same impact and level of bonding. I think that's what a lot of people get from it, especially in group situations. If that's a safe container and it's very intentional and you have a lot of the details just perfect, that is such a beneficial outcome for community and resilience and kind of overall, because that's what I love Kevin Kelly's work. He wrote this piece called "A Thousand True Fans." Kevin Kelly was the early editor at Wired, was very tied into the counterculture to cyberculture movement in Silicon Valley, and he talks about how you just need 1,000 true fans. And so that's been always my focus with Third Wave, is what is this practitioner community that we can nurture and cultivate and support with best practices, ethics, good medicine, great network, to bring this out into the broader, wider world.
Fascinating. Okay. So before you just go off and jump into your own macro dose or high dose of psychedelics, make sure that space is safe, or just get someone who's done this before to actually create that space for you, walk you through it. I feel like that's the missing piece.
Yeah. Listen to what I always say, there's 3 pillars, right? There's education. So learning, providers. Who are you choosing as a provider? We have a directory of providers on Third Wave: retreat centers, clinics, therapists, coaches that you can work with, that we've vetted. And then community. And you need a community. You need people that you're connecting with and meeting. It could be virtual, but also great in person, but starting to really build that community. I think those are the 3 things that if people are interested in, the 3 pillars, or the 3 principles to pay attention to. Probably principles more than anything.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's something to keep in mind before you go off and just go into the woods with 5 grams of mushrooms.
Yeah, which also, look, I mean, that's how I initially did LSD and mushrooms, so I can't hate on that. But have a couple friends, have someone, have people you trust and people you love, and yeah, then go do a bunch of acid in the woods. Great, and bring a picnic. That's also fun. But know what you're getting into, right? And what I tell people is start low and go slow. You don't need to like hit a home run with your first at bat, right? You can sort of work your way up. You got a lot of time here. Remember, we're not in any rush for the most part.
That's fair. So what are some things to keep in mind, like going into maybe a microdosing session, but but probably more accurately, like a larger dose? I feel like people always talk about having bad trips, or if you're in a bad place in life, that might not be the best fit for you at the moment. But what are maybe some questions we can ask ourselves, or some intentions we can set prior to having a larger dose of psychedelics?
So I talk about 5 key things just to make it easy for your audience and you. 5 key things: assessment, preparation, the experience, integration, and microdosing. We've already talked about microdosing, so I won't go through that again. But those are what I consider to be the 5 key elements of a transformative high dose psychedelic experience, right? Looking at when working with someone, and this may exclude if you're just taking acid in the woods with friends, there's probably some initial self-experimentation. But if you do want to do this within a retreat container, or you want to do this with a coach or a therapist, right, there will be an assessment. They need to know some things about you. And it's important to be 100% honest as you can, because that's going to create integrity in that container, meaning the outcome will be more beneficial. So they're going to need to know things like, are you on certain medications? Do you have a history of trauma? Have you done psychedelics before? Do you have any contemplative practices that you work with? What's your age? Have you had any medical history that we need to be aware of, right? Just like an overall intake and diagnostic. That's going to be step 1. Step 2 then is like, okay, all the boxes are checked. You're good to go. You start the preparation period for, let's say, psilocybin mushrooms. And so for about the month leading up, you maybe start to journal about it, clarify your intention. Maybe you have some coaching, or you're working with a therapist. You talk about it within that container with your coach or your therapist. You may meditate a little bit more often, eat a little healthier, less TV, less media, especially the week leading up. Just stop, slow down, work less, kind of detox overall mind, body, spirit, and then go into that with asking questions, right? An inquiry, more or less, and being curious and clarifying that intention of what is your question for the overall experience. And then find a great experience, which we talked a little bit about, our practitioner and provider community. That could be a one-on-one or group. One-on-one, I usually recommend for people if they have if they have depression, if they have certain forms of addiction, if they have PTSD, right? And that is an active clinical diagnosis. I would say typically start in a one-on-one container if you feel like there's a lot of healing to be done first. But I highly and strongly encourage group containers as much as possible, because it's so fun to do beautiful medicine experiences with great people. And I've met some of my best friends doing medicine work with them. And that's been really beautiful. So the experience matters a lot. And then integration. After you come out of that experience, there's what we call these critical learning periods, where neuroplasticity is elevated as long as 90 days after some medicine work, but typically more like 14 to 21 days. You'll have a critical period that opens up, and your focus is on what's a behavior that I can change in that critical period that will benefit me in the long term. Meditate, breath work, cold plunge, shift in diet, fasting, whatever the practice is, right? Commit to one coming out of that, and that will set you on the path to success. And then microdosing helps. So the whole key with microdosing then is it extends that critical learning period. Because for something to really become a habit, you got to do it for, I would say, 45 days. That would be my perspective. So microdosing can help to elongate that critical learning period. Potentially, I'd be curious, up to 45 days. We don't know yet. Some anecdotal data suggests that. So that's like the very practical kind of biohacker part of me. It's like just every medicine ceremony, one new healthy habit or behavior, right? And if you do that every 6 months for 10 years, you're going to be a transformed human.
Okay. That's so helpful. I feel like that's something that I want to clip that out and just use that when people ask me questions about it. That's fantastic.
Yeah. For the biohacker kind of types, I'm like the very outcome driven. I have a metaphor that I even use just to help remember this. It's like every 6 months we go to the dentist. Every day we brush our teeth. The dentist is the deep oral hygienic clean. Psychedelics are like the deep spiritual hygienic cleanse, right?
Okay.
And they open up this window where it's like commit to the practice immediately coming out of it.
I feel like I've gone into some higher dose experiences. Like I feel like most recently I went into it with kind of some ideas and questions about work, but like trying to get, I think, a little too granular. And I felt like I left that experience a bit melancholy, but I also don't think I was necessarily looking at it from what's a habit that I can install and use this as kind of a catalyst for engaging with a new healthy habit. And I was more like, looking at like holding really, really tightly to like, I want the answer to this specific question about my business rather than holding it pretty loosely, which I think was a mistake.
And there's balance in both. Sometimes the work to be done is just experiencing the moment and having fun and being like emergent with it. So I don't necessarily take that approach to my medicine work. I'm not building a habit every time I come out of it, at least with like a sort of neurotic intention or focus.
Okay.
But there is certainly times where that's been the case. And I know some people are very driven by that. For me, I'm a little bit more of a creative. I'm a little like I can do that. I've been there, but I also have found a good flow. So I'm not as committed or dedicated to that right now. But I feel like especially for people who are somewhat new to psychedelics, like for me, a lot of my good deep work got done the first 7 or 8 years that I was working with psychedelics. Now I'm really interested in like total like elevation.
Not just personal, but like community wide.
Yeah. And things like, I'm really curious about alchemy and how energy works. And, is it possible to time travel? Is it possible to, astral project? Are there ways that we can work with consciousness? Like I have one woman who has been a faculty in our training program. She's an Alaskan Indigenous woman. She's been working with medicine for 30 years, and her husband they do shit that's ESP, it's like they astral project, they can communicate non-verbally, like some really cool stuff. A lot of that is mediated by medicine, right? When you're on peyote, when you're on mushrooms, when you're on 5, it opens up those capacities. And so I'm becoming more interested in that. And that was always if we're honest, that was always the foundation of psychedelics, even in the second wave, the human potential movement, the Esalen Institute. Even what Landmark Forum became today was rooted in that, and the Hoffman process. And there's so much that came out of Esalen, and this self-actualization and Maslow's hierarchy of needs was all in that same time period. And so I'm now much more interested in the psychedelics for self-actualization. And there's something to be made for like habit building formation can help with that process substantially. They're the
Gotcha.
building blocks. It's the foundation. But
Yeah.
once we
Okay.
feel like and I would imagine you feel this way too. It's like once you've woven in enough really good, clean habits, I also still have my vices. I break the rules in certain ways, but the overall sort of structure of my life is very supportive and healthy and nourishing. I'm no longer, I mean, there are small things. I want to get a house now, for example, but I'm no longer feel preoccupied with like, I got to change things to be better. I'd say there's been a lot of deep work on even self-worth in the last few years, largely because of a partner that I dated a woman for 2 years, and that was very healing in many ways. And before that, I always felt like I was lacking something, and I find that more and more I'm feeling more content and satisfied with just kind of how things are, which is a good way to be.
Cool. Well, I mean, I'm super happy for you. Happy to hear that. But also, it's so interesting to like, kind of go back to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and think about it in this similar way, right? You like, once you build those healthy habits, once you feel really good about who you are, your self-confidence is where it needs to be, then you can get into some of the more nuanced and esoteric things,
Right.
but using this as like a stepping stone to really build the foundation to break free from those negative habits, build those positive habits, create that lifestyle that you love and enjoy being a part of. Then you can get into the astral projection and all the other stuff. But that's
Yeah,
cool. I like that.
it's like the foundational elements, I suppose. And there are some people who are just shamans who are shamanistic who can just go right to that, right? But they don't have balance elsewhere. So I'm really looking at what's full integrated balance. How can
Yeah.
you play in? What I'm really driven and curious by is how do I play in as many dimensions as possible in this human experience?
Cool. Paul, this has been really fascinating. I feel like this answered a lot of the questions that I've been getting over the past couple of months about psychedelics since I kind of touched on them in a previous podcast. So, man, I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing some wisdom with us. But where can people connect with you, or where do they go to? I know we already talked about the thirdwave.co as a place to go
Yeah.
for community education. Where else can they connect with you and find out more?
So Third Wave, thethirdwave.co. If folks are interested in the practitioner training we talked about, we're starting cohorts pretty often now. We have one that starts about every 2 months at this point in time. So, and we have a $500 discount code, low carb hustle, for the practitioner training program. And you can
Sick.
find out all the details are on that or about that on Third Wave. And then if folks want to reach out to me individually, I do some one-on-one coaching and also consulting work. So guiding people through psychedelic experiences, coaching them with microdosing, kind of supporting them on that path. If anyone is interested in that, I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Paul Austin 3W. That's the best place to reach me directly.
Awesome, man. Any like final thoughts? Anything that we did not cover today? Questions that I forgot to ask that you would like to drop before you leave?
Yeah, just two things. Oregon and Colorado have legalized psychedelics already. These are legal and accessible. You can go to these two states currently and work with psychedelics. MDMA will likely be approved this year by the FDA to treat PTSD. It'll be the first federally approved quote unquote psychedelic. And California will likely legalize psychedelics this year as well. So we're well on the way to mainstream accessibility to psychedelics. Microdosing, I think, is that bridge for folks who don't want to jump in the deep end right away. It can be a great starting point. And there's no shame in like starting low, going slow, just easing your way into it so you can get a sense of how it feels and what the landscape is. So I would just say listen to yourself and what feels good, and happy exploring.
Awesome, brother. Appreciate you. Thanks again.
Thank you.